You're listening to Neurodivergent Mates. Hello and welcome to another episode of Neurodivergent Mates. I'm your host, Will Wheeler, and today I'm joined with my special guest, Grant Sciberras. Did I pronounce it right? Yeah. All right. Yeah. Sweet. And like a lot of our listeners will know how much I stuff up people's names. So I was thinking, and I don't know if you noticed, just before we start, I had a bit of a grin on my face because I'm like, I'm gonna stuff this up. Hey, but look, welcome, man. It's a pleasure to have you. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, H, for the invite. Like it's a real privilege.
No problem. I think so just sort of a little bit of background on how Grant and I got connected was I attended, we both attended Edutech in Sydney here a few weeks ago now. Got introduced by a friend of mine, and it was just interesting to hear. So, and I'll let you explain a bit of your background, but a lot of the stuff that you're doing. So for those of you who don't know, Grant's a teacher, and doing a lot of research for his PhD. And it was actually really interesting to hear about some of these, I suppose, some of your thoughts and some of the research you're looking into and all of that into, teaching and all of that. So, look, I'm excited to get you on. But before we do actually get into anything, what I might do, just for those who might be their first time listening to us, if you haven't already done so, please subscribe, like, and follow to all of our social media platforms. We're available on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, X, Twitch, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And please follow us, like us, do whatever you need to do on anywhere where you listen to podcasts. Please subscribe to our podcast, like us, help us with the algorithm. Everything is good with that. Now, if you haven't already done so, please check out all the work we're doing with Neurodiversity Academy by visiting neurodiversity.com. Lots of great things about to be launched with some stuff there as well. Now, I'm not 100% sure if, we have some triggering stuff that we're talking about, but I might just do a little bit of a warning anyway. But some discussions may be triggering. If you need help, please reach out to a loved one or call emergency services. We're not doctors. This is a place for sharing experience and strategies. Well, I suppose you're not a doctor yet, are you, Grant? You're a doctor in the making, yeah?
Yeah, but certainly not that important.
Man. It's definitely important. So it's awesome to have you on. But before we do get into it, just if we do have any questions, please throw them into the comments where we will be wherever you're watching this. So if you're on whatever social media platform that we're on at the moment, please comment through, ask us anything that you like within moderation, of course. And let's go from there. But look, Grant, this isn't about me. This is about yourself here. So to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your journey into curriculum design and what drew you to focus on student choices, passions, and goals?
So thanks for that intro. Currently I'm a PhD student, but I was an English and history teacher for the last sort of decade, basically. And I guess the journey, it started quite early, to be honest. When I first came out of university, I was on a scholarship to teach in low SES public schools. And pretty much I've always worked in more disadvantaged communities. And you notice very quickly in those settings how often the curriculum is not really geared towards those students. And for me, it didn't take long to just notice how much students challenge that and how many students, quite openly are happy to just not do work or not want to learn because they don't see relevance in what the curriculum is offering them.
Can I just sort of go on from that? Now, you're talking about like a certain demographic. What type of demographics are you sort of speaking about out of interest? Like disengaged students or what was that?
Look, it's always, it's a mixture. Like most of the schools I've worked at are quite working class, low socioeconomic status. And so, which I know it's a very broad term generally speaking, but I guess the assumption is it's students that come from poorer backgrounds, and look, to be honest with you, I think one of the reasons why I kind of went down this path is because people might assume that the curriculum can be, the curriculum in and of itself is often designed in a way that's quite Western and colonial in its sort of nature. But we kind of overlook the fact that even working class, white Australian students can be just as disengaged and frustrated because it doesn't really speak to them. And especially as an English teacher, that was, quite obvious fairly early on. But I would say that when you're teaching in those contexts, you always have a diversity of students. In this day and age, it's kind of hard to avoid a diversity of students, regardless of what schools you go into. But in those schools, it was mostly quite working class, I would say, sort of broadly speaking.
And I think, especially when I spoke to you a few weeks ago there, I think it was interesting about, we started talking about, especially from my background of being disengaged, all of that, and especially with the curriculum. And I think the biggest thing that really drew me to yourself was that with the curriculum that's out there, it's not worthwhile a lot of the time. It's sort of along those lines. Is that what you're getting at? We're sort of talking about I don't know when the last time I learned used pi or long division, things like that. Now, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, for me, and this is part of the reason why I always find this an interesting conversation is because I was not a disengaged student. I would have been I was a very compliant kid. I did what I was told. I was, quite an all-rounder and a high achiever. So I kind of say that just to caveat that it's I don't have this kind of bent against the system. It's that it's actually I'm quite empathetic to the amount of times I've seen students question the relevance.
And I think that's the interesting thing about this. And that's why I'm like, wow, this person has had such a different experience to say myself. Yeah. This is interesting.
And look, I always use I hate to say it, and I get in trouble, it's blasphemous, as an English teacher, but I always use Shakespeare as a perfect example where, look, I enjoyed Shakespeare. I can appreciate Shakespeare. But I tell you, when you're teaching, year 9 and 10 boys out in Campbelltown, the amount of times, and it's not just those kids, that they're like, why the hell am I learning this? And you're like, yeah, I can understand why you'd ask that question. And so, it's not, I guess, and part of the reason why I use Shakespeare is because, one of the questions we're going to maybe talk about later on is around sort of policy and enablers and things. And it's kind of the good example where you see lots of different things in the system that lead to most students learning more Shakespeare than they actually have to. The policy, at least in New South Wales, says that they only have to learn it in year 9 or 10 once. That's the minimum. But it's really common practice in most schools for students to learn Shakespeare once every year they're in high school. And a lot of that goes back to the HSC and the fact that advanced English, you have to do Shakespeare. So it's often this kind of anchoring effect where what we're expecting, or what schools are measured by, HSC results, ends up having this really detrimental sort of filtering down domino effect. That means all kids, whether they're interested or not, whether their aspirations to go to university or not, kind of get lumped with all learning the same thing, regardless of their own passions or goals, and having no choice in it at the end of the day. It's just kind of thrust upon them.
It's interesting because, if I think back to some of the book, I couldn't properly read until I was, about 25, I think. I could read, but it was very the cat, very, very, I was only at a grade 5 level in grade 12. So, and there was no such thing as assistive technology back in, the late 90s there. So, and I often do think to myself, if there was certain technology, would I be able to, because I comprehend things a lot differently when it's spoken back to me and all of that type of stuff. But, thinking back to those days, especially in school, I was just why am I reading this? You know, I was actually thinking the other day, when I was in school, what is it? What's that book where they're on that island? It's all kids, and they're on the island, and they're Piggy with the glasses and that. What's that?
It's Lord of the Flies. It's
Lord of the Flies. Yeah. So
amazing.
I remember having to read that. I had no idea. Then we watched the movie, and I was like, "Oh, now I get this," you know. But I look back at a lot of this stuff now, and I think, well, why was I doing a lot of that stuff? Why couldn't I focus more on stuff that was going to help me in life?
Yeah. And look, I mean, before we kind of move on, Lord of the Flies to me is also another perfect example where a lot of the time these things go unquestioned. Like I read an article, maybe it might have been 5 or 6 years ago, but you can look this up. There was a real life case study of Lord of the Flies in Fiji. So there's some young people, like teenagers, that kind of, I think they were in a canoe or something like that, got sort of lost at sea off an island from Fiji or something along those lines. But basically, and this was in like the 60s or something, and the exact opposite of what happened in Lord of the Flies happened. Like the kids were perfectly fine, were like banded together to support one another and survive up until someone came along and found them. And you're like, to me, it's such a perfect example of, you know, a lot of the time these are canon texts, you know, texts that the Western world really reveres. And you're like, the message from Lord of the Flies is extremely depressing and really negative about humanity. And you're like, and it's based purely off, you know, an author that was largely quite like depressed. And like, I mean, not to sit here and say, you know, like depression is a serious concern, but that's kind of a perfect example where it's like, just because we want to be critical and cynical of the world, it's like, yeah, but we have a real life case study that completely contradicts that and is probably a more inspiring and important story for young people to come to instead of Lord of the Flies. But it's
Totally. Now, you've explored both the constraints and the enablers in education. What are some of the most common ways policies or stakeholders unintentionally limit student-driven learning?
So there's, from a big kind of system level, one I've kind of noticed just from the research and even being in schools, and it's a really overlooked factor, is actually just time. So, and this is, and I'm just going to sound very sort of tedious and logistical, but you know, at least in New South Wales, you have a certain amount of hours that you must study English, a certain amount of hours that you must study maths, science, and they're really inflexible on that. And so, and essentially it ends up filling the day. And therefore you don't actually, like schools, the reason why I bring that up as kind of a top level example is because schools all have to deal with this from a mandated standpoint. And so it means that leaders of schools and teachers don't even necessarily get the flexibility to actually go, okay, you know what, maybe for half a day of the week, the students can explore their own interests or do like internships or work experience that's actually geared towards their own sort of future goals and aspirations. But that's just not like, that's not even like a plausible thing in there. But, and I alluded to it before, like the greatest factor at the end of the day is outcomes and assessment. Like I've been challenging some colleagues over the last couple of years just with how much we've adopted the term outcomes, which is a very kind of economic businessy term, when at the end of the day, they're goals, really. That's what they are. And most students would probably better relate to what are my goals than my outcomes. But the whole point is that, you know, the HSE and standardized tests, they are, you know, they just have an anchoring effect where you kind of, it's almost like a leash that kind of gets pulled on what teachers can do and what schools can do, which is why, you know, it's one that I think is important just to be aware of, because like, I don't think teachers do a lot of this stuff intentionally. I think teachers are often kind of caught up in the mess of a system that has fundamental sort of structural issues in and of itself. But the reason why I sort of talk about outcomes is because, you know, you don't see in syllabus documents outcomes that say students can choose their own topics or students can set their own goals. Like that's a radical idea, which seems to me really quite odd when you think about the fact that school is for students more than anybody else. But we just don't sit here and go, you know what? Why don't you set your own goals, and why don't we support you in trying to achieve those goals? You know, it's like I say that, and it feels really common sense, but it comes across as quite radical in the system, and you know. Just to finish on that outcomes point, everything's predetermined, and that's kind of my point about why outcomes are sometimes problematic. Is that you know they are written in a way that means students are going to do this, and then they're going to do this, and then they're going to do this. It's this really kind of perfectly linear process that is almost impossible to break, and there's no space for flexibility for students. You know, stepping back or. And we know it's not linear. Like life is not linear.
This is probably where neurodivergent students really struggle in that point, because there is no flexibility there. It's like this way. And you know what? And it's funny that you speak about this before. You're like, you know, it sounds ludicrous to have kids having their own goals, or what do you want to do, right? And that is perfect for neurodivergent people's learning, because you're identifying, you know, and a big thing is we really have special interests. So if you're able to identify, I don't know, if it's a book you want to read, of course you're going to want to read that book because you're interested in it, you know. But when you've got other things, that's where it's incredibly difficult to go, oh, yeah, I'm into this. You know, it's just incredibly difficult.
Yeah. And I mean, English, again, I think it's kind of being an English teacher gives a kind of nice it's a nice experience in the sense that it makes it really obvious what some of those flaws are. Because, for instance, like one of the things we measure is or at least one of the outcomes is that students will appreciate the text. And it's like you can't force appreciation on people. You know, I really love American football, but would I be able to sit here and make everyone appreciate it? I'm like, that's pretty unfair.
Yeah, totally.
It's not and would anyone die? Would anything terrible happen if kids didn't like NFL? I'm like, no, it's okay. You know, it's not a terrible thing.
Who do you follow in the NFL, out of curiosity?
I'm a big Baltimore Ravens fan. So.
Oh, you're a Ravens fan. Interesting. Okay, cool. I do watch the NFL. I don't really have a team, just because I've never had a team. I don't know. I like the underdogs, but. You know, I loved when like the Bengals got into the Super Bowl that year. It was like, all right, you know. But yeah, anyway, man, that's an ADHD aside, tracking the whole conversation right there.
I guess, like the other two things I would say, you know, that tend to stifle it. And we don't talk about these as parents. And I hate to say that, but it's one of those things where like it's too often sort of overlooked how much, like, it's really common. And I speak to teachers from lots of different settings and I even speak to, you know, people at university. I was having a conversation with someone just the other day who works in supporting students at university and careers. And the amount of students that their default like response to why they went to university is because my parents said I have to. Like we just don't actually acknowledge how often parents do influence a lot of the choices students could make. And electives, you know, are a good example. Like insert student, my child's going to be a doctor, a lawyer, that sort of thing. And you're like, or that, you know, they're not dropping out. Like there's so much sort of negativity about doing a trade and going down a pathway that isn't, like it's so a lot of those things are really problematic. I've taught students that wanted to go into a trade but had to stay until the end of year 12, even though they could not stand it. And they were, you know, and we need people doing trades. Like it's a really society.
There's actually a lot. You could probably, with a lot of trades, you can actually make a lot more money than say some like going to university and getting a degree in some other jobs. You know what I mean? And you're definitely right. There's almost like this. And especially, and we see it in the vocational sector and like the higher education sector, where there's almost this us and them type of thing, because it's like trades, training, all of that, where you got this. But there's so much money to be made in those in those spaces. It's just like a friend of mine. She was sort of the same. She kicked up a big stink about not going to university. Ended up going to TAFE, I think, getting a like an IT certificate. Now has got this really awesome paying job in Microsoft. And this is the thing. I think it's so important that and it's so interesting you do talk about parents, because parents do have such a big influence on how kids sort of progress, or it could even be parents can also have a bit of an influence on their children's mental health, because they're putting them through so much just to be able to get through exams, all of that. But no, it's definitely true. There can be a lot of big problems there.
Yeah, and like I said, it's always a tenuous conversation, because parents are often, I think in the media, I think people are scared to actually critique parents a lot of the time. I think it's easy to critique teachers because that's their profession, and you can the government can kind of control those things, but you can't do that with parents. And so it's always quite hard to have those honest conversations, I think.
I think with my parents, especially, like my parents are awesome, by the way, because they're probably listening, so I better not say anything bad about them. But not that I have anything bad to say about them. But I think the big thing when I was younger was I was the oldest kid, so like parents are learning. They might be hearing stuff from other parents. They might be seeing their friends' kids who are going and doing other things, and they're like, I want my kid to be like that as well. So, is it that type of stuff? I have no idea, but they do definitely play a huge role.
Totally. And look, I think that kind of gets to the heart of a lot of these big systemic and stakeholder things you talk about there, is that often the kind of sad thing is it's often really well-intentioned. Like, it's often done out of an anxiety. There's a lot of fear around giving students freedom. There's a long history of this as well. Like, we're always scared to give children and young people freedom because something might happen. There's what's going to happen.
Totally. And I think totally. And I honestly think that flows into the net. That's why I was like, I've got to put this up right here. So how do you approach designing curriculum that gives students real freedom to pursue their interests while still meeting learning outcomes or accreditation standards?
So if you look at the research on differentiation, which is, it's very common terminology for teachers, it's just being able to meet students where they're at. There's 4 ways that they talk about differentiation. So they talk about it in terms of the product. So what is it that students are going to produce at the end of their learning? And you can give students freedom in that. You can allow students to, do a podcast, to do, a presentation, do something like present in ways that better suits their actual interests and strengths. So that's one of the more kind of obvious ways to do it. We also talk about process. So how do they actually come to that end product? So what are the resources that they use, or giving students freedom to actually use different technology or draw on different research to actually come to their conclusions. The content, to me, is always, and that's kind of the one that I think is often the biggest, both the biggest motivator and the biggest challenge. So giving students the choice to pick different topics or to explore something, like as a history teacher, I often use, I think thematic approaches to history are often the best ways to do it. So as an example, you might let students explore something like imperialism and have them look at different case studies of imperialism, rather than saying we're all going to learn just about Australian history. You could look at, as a class, we can explore Australian history, but you yourselves can actually pick a different case study of imperialism. There's plenty to choose from. There's a lot.
Totally. But does that make it a bit more difficult for the teachers then? Like, because say for example, when you're marking, right, you've got probably a marking sheet or something like that, and you're like, yes, this means that. Does that make it harder for the teachers then, out of curiosity?
So And that's often the argument I kind of get, or at least like often sometimes it's a pushback you get. And look, I would say again, it often comes back to what language do you use when it comes to the outcomes. So as an English teacher, and history has this benefit too, but it does kind of fall into sometimes a habit of being overly content focused. But if you design outcomes that are a lot more concerned about the skills that you're developing rather than the content and knowledge that students are demonstrating, then you can kind of free up and make it a lot less difficult for teachers. Because, for instance, like at university, it's a good example. Like I've been marking at university and teaching university for 5 years now. We often get, like, students will do a literature review as an example, but they have complete freedom to pick whatever topic they want to. And so what I'm actually largely marking them on is the quality of the work that they're doing, how well they're actually, demonstrating the skills of someone that's doing a good literature review, the ability to synthesize a bunch of information and sources, make critical judgments of the methods that are being used. And so that's what I mean by, like, you can do it in a way that's actually, it's not like, as a teacher, you don't always have to be the expert. I was having this conversation with my supervisor like earlier today that we have a real anxiety, I think, as a broad society, talking about teachers and not realizing that we are experts in a space, like in the sense of, I'm an expert as a history teacher, but there's how much history is out there? It's infinite. I can't possibly know all of it. And if you speak to most teachers, like, when curriculum changes, and because there's often a variety of options in the curriculum, you're always having to kind of catch up. And it doesn't mean you always know absolutely everything in the room. And it's like, we kind of, as a society, have to let go of that. Like, it's okay that we don't. Like, we literally we're hitting it on the internet. We've had the answer to things for 20 odd years.
Have you ever been caught out by a student? Like, you've been like, oh my God, actually, I think you're right.
In that comment, or
like in it, like, let's say, like, you've been teaching something and they've said, but this and that and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, gee, I don't know. I'll check it out. Oh yeah, you're actually right.
It happens all the time. Like, I'm sitting here saying I have no idea what I'm doing. But you do. You often have, and that's, I think that's really the kind of beauty of it. Like, it's one of the nice things about being in a classroom is that, you want it to be a space where it's all about learning, and it's like, and there's a flattening of that hierarchy that, yes, I'm a bit of an expert in this, but students always have things that they bring that I don't know about. And that's the beauty of working in a space of learning. It's like, it's not about who's the person that's right, but just that we as a collective are able to grow, from that collective knowledge and experience and strength. So
out of curiosity, right? And I often think about this, like, obviously, you got your, I wouldn't call them bad students, but maybe students who maybe mess around, all of that. What's the, and I've seen it myself working within the training sector, all of that. And, when you can really connect with someone like that and really see the best come out of it, I can't even explain it, but the feeling of like, oh my God, I've been able to connect with this person is just next level. What's some example? You don't have to share them, but what's some things you've sort of noticed when you've been able to connect with students like that out of curiosity?
Well, I still remember, and I kind of use this all the time as my example that kind of took me on this journey. So my third year down at Campbelltown, I was teaching 3 Year 9 classes, which is, for people that's like, what a nightmare. It's like,
and sorry, just for our listeners as well, just to get an understanding of Campbelltown, you would sort of say is quite a pretty full-on sort of place in Sydney, like pretty rough, yeah?
Yeah, it's like I said, it's what you would call low SES. Sorry, I've got a dog that's just walking in on me here.
No, all good.
Yeah, it's like it's a diverse community. It's a lot more working class. It's it's about it's probably about an hour out just from Parramatta. So to get into the city, it's probably over an hour.
So it's quite far away. It's closer, probably closer to Wollongong than the center of the city.
Yeah, like it's certainly not regional, but it's kind of it's but it's certainly quite on the outskirts. But yeah, so in terms of so when I was teaching there, I had there's often this lull at the end of the year. So in the last sort of 4 to maybe 6 weeks of the year, and students know this too, like it's kind of not a secret, that basically you get all of your assessment tasks are done, all reports have now been written and they're going out to parents. And so all of these things we might consider like extrinsic motivators, the carrot and the stick that kind of teachers can call upon, that reports haven't been finished yet, you kind of things to incentivize students to stay on task. A lot of those things are gone. And so in the last sort of 5-6 weeks of my final year there, I wanted to test kind of this theory out. And so I gave students a project. I said to them, and it was very, the parameters were pretty loose. I just said, look, it should be kind of equivalent to about 500 words. I want you to use multiple sources because, again, as a history teacher, I always think it's important to use multiple sources. And I wanted it to not be something that they could just answer from Google straight away. And that they had to have sort of like a reference list or bibliography at the end of it. And they could present it kind of however they wanted. If they want to do PowerPoint, if they want to do, speech, whatever it was, I didn't mind. But, the students got to pick what the question was. And I remember this student who he had, like from memory, either he didn't submit any assessment tasks throughout the year, or if he did, they were always late. Like just no matter how much scaffolding and support I offered. And we didn't have a bad relationship. Like there was a number of kids in that class that were definitely on the spectrum and were quite, and I often loved working with those kids because I feel like I'm a little, quirky and nerdy and old in myself. So I can definitely, go deep dive into something. So, and so, this student said, asked me, do you know the band Tool? And I was like, yeah, of course. Like, I grew up with most of my cousins. Like, metal was kind of the only thing that was played from most of my cousins and things like that. So
totally.
And so I was like, yeah. And he goes, well, like, this was around the time they were before their last album that took years for them to kind of release, and there was a big kind of build up for it.
Oh, that was the last one, right? After 10,000. So not 10,000 Days, the newer one. Yeah, that took a long time to come out.
Yeah. And so it was right around that time. And he was like, oh, there's been talk about this for a while that, it's going to come out. Can I do my question on, when's this going to come out? And sort of deep dive into that. Well, like, yeah, sure. And he, like, that student for the rest of the next 5-6 weeks. And again, mind you, this is the end of the year. Kids are like
looking at they're done. They're cooked.
Could not care less. Like they're looking. And I walk into that class, and he was focused, like just keen to work every single session. And he wasn't the only one. Like there was other ones too, but it was like and even just the kind of excitement and surprise when I was like, yeah, of course you can work on it. That's fine. Like I was so laissez-faire about it. I was like, yeah, well, duh. I'm like, as long as you pick multiple sources, like, that's fine. It sounds like, that would take, 500 words. I'm like, yeah, you could do that. So it's logical. And so, that to me was just, it was kind of a light bulb moment where I'd sort of been.
That is pretty awesome. Even hearing that, I think, and I can actually put myself in that kid sort of mindset type of thing, especially being like, because I remember, and it's not sort of the same, but it's a little bit different. But I remember we had to like write about like a poet, right? Yeah. And I'm like, oh man, I hate these poets sound like idiots type of thing, right? But I was a huge Rage Against the Machine fan, right? So I picked Township Rebellion, the actual song there, and wrote about that. But I I got an E for that one. But just the thought of it, I remember when I was writing it and all of that, I was like, man, this guy's an awesome poet, because he technically is a poet.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? But because it wasn't your typical poet, I just failed miserably on that, But I just remember feeling like, man, this is going to be the best. And then, I just completely failed.
Yeah. But that's like, that to me is a good example of it. It's like, there's so much opportunity for students to actually enjoy learning. And that's often kind of taken away by the rigidity of what they have to learn and how we measure things and those outcomes, because that's exactly right. Like, the outcomes in and of themselves are likely what gives you that result. And it's like, it's such an unreasonable.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally, because I probably, like that kid you're talking about, I would have put in 100% if I could have been like, oh, right, And yeah, such a good point. But moving on from that, and I think this really flows into the next question, well, what are some ways educators and curriculum designers can advocate for more inclusive student-led practices, even when the system feels rigid?
It's a tough. Like, honestly, it is one of those things. It's a tough thing to do. Like I said before, in terms of the differentiation, like, I think that there are opportunities in the way in which you teach, and often it's the thing that's hard is that it often depends on the subject. Like maths and science are notoriously, they're notoriously driven by content, and you have to learn this, and this. But there are opportunities to find ways to give students that sort of freedom and give students, like I said, choice. I often use choice because it's kind of the one almost realistic kind of middle ground where it is so rare and hard to give that pure kind of freedom that I did. Like I said, I did that at the end of the year. And look, that is a good example where for a lot of teachers, they can do it in that kind of lull period outside of what is often mandatory, like reporting and not mandatory reporting. This is a mandatory assessment and reports going out to parents. So those periods of time are certainly good opportunities to trial doing that sort of stuff. And I think, for me, I've always been just a big fan of making a concerted effort to get feedback from students. For me, I always try to get input as much as possible, and creating a culture where that is normalized. I think a lot of my students, because this would have been 2016, and that, like, when I was first starting out, like, I think a lot of them were probably like, what the hell is he doing? Because it was normal for me to have like a Google form, and I was like, it's anonymous. Like, if you want to put your name on it, you can, but just, tell me what you'd like to learn and things like that.
Yeah, I can see it right now. They would have been like, what the hell is he doing? I'm not filling this out. Did you get many fill it out?
I did from time to time. Like if I was to go back in time, it's one of those things where I kind of wish I'd just gone, you're going to fill it out. Like it's a weird, it's a weird irony that often to get students' voices out there or to get that input, you have to kind of force them to do it, which just
you could have made it a part of the class. So, okay, everyone, today what we're going to do, we need to fill this out. This is a requirement, something, because that's what I found with teaching. Like, you can almost control it in the way you want it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the phrasing does make a big difference.
Totally. Crazy.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think. Yeah, outside of, look, I mean, it's a bit of a shameless plug, but like, part of what got me onto this journey, even just to meeting you, was I presented at the Student Voice Conference about 6 weeks ago, and I think getting students out into those spaces is really useful. Often they're places that are trying to advocate for students more often. And same with Universal Design for Learning. I was at the conference there last week for that. And Universal Design.
How did that go? I was going to go to that. What was that? That was at like UNSW, right?
No, Sydney. So that's what,
Sydney, was that where it was? Okay, yeah, I was going to go to that, but I just couldn't get time off work because I'd been doing so many others. What was that like?
Sorry, dog. I'm
Nah,
just
all
going
good.
to close this door before he comes back in.
No, no problem, no problem at all. But yeah, just for the listeners, there was like a Universal Design of Learning conference at Sydney University last week. I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and look, like the funny thing is that when like I said to you, when I started this journey, like I came from it more so not like it's not that I think it totally fits within universal design for learning. It's like a fundamental, giving flexibility, giving autonomy, giving agency to students is like a core principle and practice of universal design for learning. But when I started this journey, I wasn't coming at it from that lens necessarily. I was coming at it from a, engagement standpoint, just being tired of seeing students that came to school and saw no purpose in their learning. And that was like, and that goes across the spectrum. Like, it is like even really capable students have that experience where they're like, this is boring. Why the hell am I, and so, but yeah, so look, it was really good. The people there, like even some of the people that were there in the presentations they were doing were things that I was like, this is really informed, like gives a lot more clarity for my own research. It's quite interesting because I guess at a university level, there's a bit more sort of freedom to involve students, but at the same time, I think because a lot of academics don't come from actual teaching backgrounds, universal design for learning is almost like a new thing for a lot of them. The more I spoke to people there that had been with universities for a while, that were advocates of it and did it at university and did research in it as well, they're like, yeah, a lot of teachers have been doing this stuff for ages, but people at university are kind of first and foremost researchers before teachers.
Yeah.
Obviously, some love both, but or love a bit of teaching more. But that's kind of it's the nature of the tertiary.
Yeah, it's so true when you say that because in one of Neurodiversity Academy's academic board, one of our board meetings, one of the board members, she shared that. She's like, yeah, well, one of the biggest problems is that a lot of the lecturers, they're not actually teachers. No. They've gone and done all this stuff somewhere else, and then they're just all of a sudden teaching, and they don't have all of those skills.
Yeah, it's a different skill set. Like it's and it's kind of assumed. I think people might just assume because they're academics that they're going to be good teachers, and it's like I'm sure most. No disrespect to academics, but I've heard
no, all good. I get it. I totally get it. But it probably goes hand in hand with teaching as well. You've got some teachers who really gravitate to it, and then you've got some who just they may be doing it for a paycheck type of thing. I hate to say it,
No, totally. Yeah, teaching does. I often I say it to even my undergrads when I'm the future teachers that teaching is a weird profession in that. Because learning is endless, like it's infinite, and students you're dealing with 30, 50. If you're a high school teacher, you're dealing with 150 plus students. Plausibly, you could work every minute of the day. Like you could always work. There's always things you could improve on and help kids from a learning standpoint. But it's also a job where for some people, you could do the bare minimum and still get by. Like it's a weird thing. Like it's.
Well, do you know what? Right, I felt, and I often talk about this, is that with some of my teachers, the ones who I really gravitated to and did really well, they were those ones who really put in that effort and got behind me and maybe a little bit kicked my ass a little bit, but in a way that I respected them. But then I had other teachers where I just failed miserably and did really bad because it felt like because they had to do more work with me, I was too much of a hassle compared to the ones who were just perfect and they could just make their job easier.
Yeah. We always talk about it. It is an extremely relational job. Like it's one that depends so much on relationships, how you are able to actually build that connection and support and encourage students, which, I guess coming back to the kind of start of this, like it's one of the reasons why the curriculum has been my sort of interest for a long time, because it's the kind of one thing that students and teachers have to kind of mediate and navigate. Like, this is what we're going to learn. This is how we're going to learn it. And this is what we're being told you have to learn. And it's like, at the end of the day, teachers and students, that's the thing they kind of experience the most in the classroom is, this is the topic we're going to cover. These are the outcomes we're going to meet. And you're like, even as a teacher, for instance, you can try and jazz things up and make things really interesting, but sometimes it's like just not possible.
We actually spoke about this, didn't we? We said, hey, you could jazz it up, but at the end of the day, the kids are going to see straight through it and go, man, this is bull crap. You know what I mean?
Totally. Yeah, teenagers are which is, it goes back to that whole, the advocacy point, is that we kind of overlook, and I think it's one of the things that a lot of, even colleagues overlook this. I sort of said that when students are choosing not to learn, that is still a choice. Like, students always have agency. So when they look at this and they go, well, I don't care about this, they're making a choice, So this model, this kind of curriculum model where we're just going to insert this knowledge into your head and, it's very factory-esque. It's like, it's not even realistic. Like, kids will choose to care or not. And it's like,
totally.
We kind of just don't grapple with that reality. It's very passive.
Totally. Moving on from that one, how can we ensure that neurodivergent students or those with less traditional learning profiles truly benefit from a more flexible curriculum model?
It's a good question, because the funny thing is, and it depends often on the student, especially students on the spectrum, for instance. Sometimes too much freedom is actually overwhelming. And same thing with sometimes too much choice is overwhelming. I often I always use the Netflix YouTube analogy. Like, how many people, and I'm sure you
can't find what I'm looking for.
Yeah. It's awful. It's like,
finally, what should I watch?
Yeah, you spend like 15 minutes. I do it. The amount of times I do it, I'm in bed. I'm like, I want to relax. And I'm like this. I spend 15 minutes trying to pick something, and it's like nearly 9 o'clock. I'm like nearly getting close to going to bed or something, like actually falling asleep. I'm like, what was the point?
Totally.
So, yeah. And look, to be honest with you, I've often found the sweet spot is offering I guess, both choice in the sense of, you can pick a topic that you're really interested in or something you're really passionate about, or here's a selection of topics that kind of make sense with what we're looking at. And I find that's almost the kind of perfect middle ground, because what it does is it tends to, for students that actually are like, and there are some students that are like, for instance, on the spectrum that are like, I love this topic and I want to look at it. And it's like, and if you've got that choice of, okay, that's the one that you're going to look at, it satisfies that need. But for the students that are, maybe are really unsure and they don't actually know what they're interested in or whatever it is, giving that selection of topics at least gives a bit of clarity and kind of narrows that overwhelming sense of too much autonomy. And look, I've seen that with almost all students, that, students that aren't even necessarily neurodivergent can also get overwhelmed by too much choice or too much freedom. That's why there does need to be some degree of structure. And I think that
totally agree.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. I think, especially even in business and all of that type of stuff, right? Like, when you're in business, it is so incredibly difficult to know how to start, where to start, what the hell you're doing, because a lot of the time you're on your own, right? You've got no one, you've got many choices, but you've got no one really to guide you. So this is why I have mentors, people who help me with things. I ask them questions because I need them to guide me, because that structure, we're almost creating that structure ourselves. And you're dead right. We still do need some form of structure there at the end of the day.
Yeah, and again, I mean, like I said, it's a pretty unsexy topic to start with in terms of the time in the curriculum. But I was like, but that's a good example where it's like, actually, yeah, you do, you have to give that time, and you also have to recognize, like checkpoints or provide some degrees. And look, when I used to do some of my own sort of more project-based teaching, a lot of the time I saw teachers that used to do project-based learning, because they kind of viewed it in this really progressive, free-flowing inquiry way, that meant a lot of students got lost. And so often there was a lot of structure I would put into it, but still there was freedom for students to explore. And so, for instance, you might set structure in terms of giving them, templates or scaffolds that allows them to know, okay, like if you're going to research online, here's how you might structure your notes, or here's some steps for, how to research well. Like, they're things that I'm not sitting here stopping you from exploring what you want to explore. I'm just giving you some structure, some strategies, so that it's not so overwhelming, and you're doing it in a way that's a lot more systematic, less overwhelming, and actually is going to streamline your own sort of thinking, so that when you need to kind of take this stuff down, it's so much easier.
Yeah, you're dead right there. And a big thing with Neurodiversity Academies, so with our endorsements, all of that, a big thing we're looking for is, when do you have like examples of what an assessment needs to look like? Because, if this is your first time doing a project or something, or an assessment, imagine like never doing anything like that, and then going into university and then having to structure it how it needs to be, and you have no idea how it needs to be. You're going to fail miserably. And then that person might quit and go, stuff this, I can't do it, So no, you're dead right with that.
Yeah. And that's, like the last couple of years, I've come to realize how much, and there's lots of different, like the funny thing is there's research from lots of different spaces that actually shows, like not just for neurodivergent students, but for all students, how much like actual work samples and an example or exemplar, like visible things that actually show us this is what it should look like, or what you're trying to get to, it makes it so much easier for everyone. Like it's particularly, I think, helpful for neurodivergent students, but regardless, it's actually lots of other students benefit from it as well. It's kind of the irony. Like, totally,
that's almost just like universal design of learning, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
But crazy stuff. Look, we are getting towards the end, and we've got a few more questions to get through. But looking ahead, what's one change you'd love to see in how we design learning, and what can people listen to? And what can people do? What did I say? Listening help.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think what the hell, that was ChatGPT. So how did that stuff that up? And what can people listen to help make it happen? I don't know.
Listening.
I'm for sure you got what. I think what I'm talking about.
Yeah, you're right. So look, for me, I think in terms of how we design learning, I think it is just having student input be far more normalized. And that's why I started with the outcomes, because like I said, it doesn't sound kind of sexy. It sounds kind of abstract and very kind of policy think, but it's like, you actually just need to create time and space for students to actually have input on what is the learning going to be? What do I want to learn about? How do I want to learn these things? And being a lot more flexible in that. There's some schools that I've looked at that are trying to go beyond just the school walls and working with local communities, local business, or hybrid models with flexible learning online. Like, there's so much freedom in doing that, but there's a lot of rigidity around, schools and the structures that they kind of put in place that don't allow for that. And I guess I say student input, because it's one of those things that can happen at so many different levels. Like, as a classroom teacher, you can do that just by actually asking routinely, at the start of the year, start of units, getting students input on different practices and processes. And at the same time, it can be done at a really high level, in terms of actually mandating and policy and things like that. So, And that sort of second part, what can people do to help make it happen? Look, I mean, it's a bit of a shameless plug, but the Australian Council for Student Voice, I'm now on the board. This has been a real crash course. I met some of the sort of founders, Mitch Sprague, and a couple of others at the end of last year at a conference. And they've done a really excellent job of trying to connect all across Australia students at sort of different levels, even primary and secondary. And I think that they've put together a framework to try and advise policy, but also to try and advise teachers and school leaders for how to actually enable students to have a lot more agency and voice in what they're learning about. And so I think that, following them, supporting their work, going to the Student Voice Conference was very much led by them. And I think doing a lot more to get involved in those spaces, because they're, like I said, they're working on a couple of different things to try and make it a lot more normal to actually just go, oh yeah, what do young people want and what do students want? And maybe we should bring that into policy. Maybe we should bring that into education. It's like radical.
Makes sense, right? Awesome. No, that's awesome, man. Look, thank you so much for coming on today. Look, if people want to connect with you, where can they best find you? Where do they go to find your awesome self?
Oh man. Look, LinkedIn is the place I'm trying to get more onto these days. And it's just my name on here. Look, I'm in this weird space of realizing I probably need to do more in this space of going, actually, I probably should share some of my stuff.
Yeah, totally. And where can people actually check out your research and doing all of that? Has it been released yet or?
Not yet. I'm planning to present some of the work at the end of this year at the AARE conference. We'll see if that does happen. But look, I'm trying to be a lot more active in general in social media spaces. Look, if I'm totally honest with you, I used to use I still do, tend to use my private Instagram as my rant space.
Oh, really? Okay, cool.
But it's one of those things where I'm like, I really need to stop doing this because most of my friends don't care about this or don't care about it.
I learned that with my Facebook and that. So yeah, you get, and at first they interact at first, and then like you get no one like it. It's just like, not that they don't like it. I think they're just like on a whole complete different level. Yeah.
So yeah, look, that's what I would say. I would say, my LinkedIn is the best place. I'm trying to do a lot more to connect with people because you're right. Like it's, and this has been a real privilege, and thanks, so much for even just asking. Because,
no problem.
Advocacy in this space, you have to share ideas, and you do have to actually,
totally.
talk spaces a lot more.
Totally. And I think it's so important to be connecting with so many different people doing different things and sort of coming together and saying, okay, well, this is my experience. Like your and I experience are completely different to each other. But I think, we're able to come together in that middle ground and get it. It's very rare to find people who can sort of see it from both sides, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And look, to me, like I went down this kind of research path because from an advocacy perspective. For me, I'm very much a pragmatist. I like solving problems. I get quite frustrated sitting in them. And I always have different ideas and solutions. And, I'm really considering starting up. I had a tutoring business years ago just to test my ideas. I don't know if it would be tutoring now, but I'm really considering Future Fundamentals was basically a model that I put together to try and actually show how we might be able to do curriculum differently and put the purpose back in students' hands. Like that was really what the whole point of it was.
Yeah.
And so I put together, at the Student Voice Conference, I presented some of the work that I'd done there. And so, like I said, I would go to LinkedIn first. I'll get
cool. Sweet.
I'm sure I'll have a website on Future Fundamentals soon enough.
Sweet, mate. Once you get something up, we'll try and post it up there and get some people on there. But Grant, thank you so much for coming today. Look, for all of our listeners, please connect with Grant. Check him out through LinkedIn or maybe his Instagram page where he's doing all of his rants, all of that. But Grant, Thanks so much for coming on today, brother. It's been a pleasure. And for anyone else, if this is the first time checking us out, please subscribe, like, and follow to all of our social media platforms. My name's Will Wheeler. This is Neurodivergent, mates. Till next time.